Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you recall last episode, we were talking about the startups and the emerging trends happening in political tech on the American left. And one of the main areas of interest is political influencers, and in particular, the professionalization of political influencers as a medium for voter contact. And so this is something that I'm sure you've seen reported about in the media. It's something that I wanted to dig into a little bit below the surface, because what you'll often hear is that influencers are effective because they're used in corporate branding, they foster a lot of trust with their supporters and create these parasocial interactions. I think all that stuff is true, but the more that I kind of read into this and think about it, I mean, there's very clear, concrete structural incentives for campaigns to adopt influencers. The most obvious is that political advertising on TikTok is banned. So you literally need a human vessel to carry your political message organically, right? To reach that huge audience. So that's one. But there's also clear incentives because the media is so primed to look for when an influencer does have a successful message in the context of politics, that a successful influencer marketing message almost guarantees you some earned media, some mainstream media play. And increasingly, in a fragmented social media environment, a message on TikTok could easily spill over onto Twitter, onto Instagram, wherever else. And then the cost for a campaign to reach a very large audience could be even less than advertising on Facebook or Instagram, for example. So I think the real story here is that there's concrete structural incentives for campaigns to adopt influencers. And this has ramifications for the EU in terms of getting around campaign finance restrictions. We usually see political tech adoption first in the US and then other countries follow. So this is a space to watch. And I wanted to find out what's happening now in terms of this professionalization of political influencers. What does the infrastructure look like, boots on the ground? So my guest to discuss this is Fang. He is the head of sales and business development at Vocal Media, which is a company that is building a database of influencers to connect with political advocacy organizations, causes, and political campaigns on the left. And in this interview, we'll talk about this database that Vocal Media is building, as well as sort of how they gauge influencers that might be interested in politics. What do they look for when selecting influencers from the mass that are out there across TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, etc. We'll also talk a little bit about Twitch and Discord and how they might be used for politics. And in particular, I was curious to find out, what's the real utility of influencers? Are they just human vessels for mass broadcasting, or can they also be used for more long-term political organization as well? And Zach's perfectly positioned to talk about this because he's done field directing and field organizing work for campaigns such as Bernie Sanders in 2016 and Andrew Yang in 2020. So without further ado, let me turn it over to my guest, Fang. Again, he is the head of sales and business development at Vocal Media. Zach, thanks for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
So to start out, can you give our listeners a brief introduction to Vocal Media and the types of influencers you're working with? And since you've worked on more traditional campaigns as well, what sets the type of work that Vocal Media does apart from other forms of campaigning like field organizing?
So we work more on creator-driven social media platforms. So a lot on TikTok, a lot on Instagram, a lot on YouTube Shorts. We've done some Twitch work, very familiar with Discord. And what we do is we work with creators who each have their own channel for a variety of things. And we work with creators and partners to get out the partners' messaging through the creators' channels. Typically, we work with influencers between like 150,000 and a million, maybe 2 million followers. We kind of find that's the best bang for your buck ROI-wise. And they're also small enough that they still have these kind of like niche, authentic communities. Their audience really feels that they know them. You just don't get that with much bigger creators and much smaller creators. You're usually paying a lot more per view because they're just not going to get the reach of someone that's, that has 150,000 plus followers. And as far as what sets the work, like reason I kind of do this as opposed to the traditional campaigns like I used to, is one is the reach. Like you can just reach a different group of people. It's not like tied to like, oh, you need their cell phone number and the voter file type of stuff. And I just think everyone, like, it's just where society is moving towards. Like 10 years ago, you could make YouTube, you could kind of have your own channel, but it took a lot of work. Whereas now, you can make a TikTok in the app, you can use CapCut to make slightly higher quality videos. It's just a lot more accessible to make content. And the other reason I really like it on the inclusivity side is, when I was doing campaigns, it was like you would go somewhere, work for 6 months, get paid close to nothing, not work. And then if you wanted to work again, you had to move. And, someone like me that grew up middle class and could go back and stay at their parents' house and didn't have a ton of responsibilities in their 20s, that was fine. But that's not most Americans. Or the other option, if you want to do politics, is you have to go to DC, get an unpaid internship, pay, at least $1,500 in rent for a studio. And again, that's not accessible to most Americans. So what was interesting to me is we have this kind of diversity issue in politics. A lot of it, I think, is actually stemmed from the fact that it's really hard to even get in the door, like the entry-level jobs you need to be in a position of privilege to do. And that's not with this influence stuff, that's not the case. Like you can be a voice, you can be an organizer, and all you need is TikTok, all you need is Instagram. So it opens the door for kind of who can do this a lot more. And that's something that always kind of bothered me in campaigns was everyone else that did campaigns kind of came from my background. And that really caused issues with our messaging and caused issues with a lot of things. And doing something like this, it kind of flips the script. It's like the only form of advertising where most of the money that's coming in isn't going to like platforms from CEOs or shareholders. Most of the money that comes in is going directly to young people of color.
Yeah, that's super interesting from like a, democratization perspective. I hadn't heard that argument before. And, I wanted to ask you, we'll pick up more on the kind of cost and ROI side a little bit later. But I wanted to ask you a bit about the industry that's popping up around this, because I came across Vocal Media through reading Higher Ground Labs Tech Landscape Report, which we covered last episode. And there was a whole section on influencer marketing for politics, and they mentioned a couple other startups and some initiatives by the DNC. And so I'm just curious about, the differences that other startups and initiatives are doing within this kind of influencer marketing for politics. And basically, I'm wondering, are we simply seeing a kind of competitive marketplace developing around connecting influencers with campaigns, or is everyone, trying to differentiate themselves within this space?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think one thing that we like at Vocal we do differently is we're not an agency. We don't represent people. So what you see is a lot of like agencies will, they might have 50 or 60 creators that they work with, and they might say, oh, like this one would kind of work, this one would work for your campaign. What we do is we're a lot more client focused, and we actually try to figure out who exactly would be the best influencers. So we have over 5,000 that we've kind of worked with before. We have over 30,000 in our database. And what we do for every campaign is actually source the best influencers we can find on the internet for that campaign. So that's, one strategy that we do that's a little different than some others. But I think it's just a new evolving space, and just people are constantly learning and innovating. There's going to be people doing stuff that we couldn't even think of in the future, probably.
Definitely. And I'm glad you brought up the database, because I'm very curious to hear about this. And I'm curious, can you explain the process of building this database and identifying these creators? Was it like manually just searching profiles and hashtags across platforms, or what was the process like?
It was that there were some tools you can use like IQ data to help source influences, and what we would do is put in similar ones we like. The problem with a lot of the existing databases is it's not really set up well for politics. So, for example, like if you're a commercial marketer, you don't necessarily care, what issues the person is interested in. Whereas if in politics, you want to know, is this person interested in LGBTQ rights? Is this person interested in immigration? Because they're going to be able to do much better content if they actually have some personal authenticity to that video. It's a lot of building. We have a full team of like people kind of finding new creators to put in there, and then just making also sure their values align. So no one in the database is a Republican. We're going knowing that we're going to be reaching out to people who want to support our campaigns. And that's just also an offering that isn't available in any of the more commercial ones.
Gotcha. And I want to come back to the database, but first, it's a question that's been bothering me as I was preparing for this episode you know, is the correct term for these actors influencers or creators? Because I think in academia, we tend to use the term influencers, but I've noticed in a lot of the marketing material that they tend to be called creators. So are these interchangeable terms, or is there some difference between them?
So I am not really a creator. It's hard for me to say for sure. I mean, I think like if you're creating content, like that's what you do. So I think a lot of creators are going to refer to themselves as creators as opposed to like I influence people. So I hear it used more, like I hear creators kind of refer to themselves more. I think you can use it interchangeably, but I think that we're just moving more into like people just saying creator. And it also just sounds better.
Yeah, I was just wondering because it seems when you get into politics, it's maybe a bit kind of loaded to say that, hey, we're hiring these influencers to influence people's opinions, right? Rather than just creating videos is a bit more neutral.
Yeah, no, it comes more from the creators themselves. It wasn't like a strategic decision we made. And I think if this is your identity, I think you just might want to you see yourself as a creator rather as someone that gets paid to influence people.
Right. So back to the database. I'm curious, can you fill us in on the types of like categories that you use to segment these influencers? I mean, I think for the academic listeners, we'd be interested to hear about the variables that are included in this data set. I mean, I'm assuming it's things like their audience size, what platforms they're active on, maybe their gender, their age, things like that. I mean, what types of ways can clients search the database, or can you search the database to match clients with creators/influencers?
Yeah, I think two kind of key things that, again, I mentioned earlier that we have that other ones don't have are the issues in the identity piece. Like most commercial databases, you can't search if someone identifies as LGBTQ. Most commercial databases, you can't search if someone identifies an educator, if someone identifies a union member, thing like that are relevant in politics. And same with the issues, what are they passionate about? So we kind of track all that stuff in our database. And the thing I'd kind of add that what I'm not seeing is recently, it's not just follower count, but it's really engagement rate and recent views. So the engagement rate being how many people are like commenting, liking, doing something with the piece of content. You want to usually have an engagement rate above 5%. So that is a lot of the commercial databases, but recent engagement rate, recent average views would be other things that we would have that you didn't mention earlier.
That's interesting. I have a couple follow-up questions on that. I mean, is the engagement rate a way to basically make sure that there's not artificial followers? Like, because I guess people could, pay for bots or whatever, create accounts, and then the engagement rate would signal that at least 5% of this audience is real, or is it more about that they can actually engage people?
More the former. And then the other thing is a lot of creators might have been big before, or, like they're just not as big as they used to be, especially like a lot of micro creators. It might be like 20,000 followers. So we usually don't do it. They might have had one viral video, but it's not like they have like a core audience that's constantly following them. So engagement rate is just helpful to determine things like that. Have they already peaked? Do they still have an engaged audience?
Yeah, interesting. It totally makes sense. And I wanted to ask you a bit about how well these influencers sort of carry over into politics, because these are not, I think for most of the people in the database, they're not sort of political marketers first, right? They're doing their own creative thing, or they're, working on behalf of brands. And so I'm just wondering, how well do brand marketing logics correspond to political marketing, in the sense that, if I trust an influencer to recommend me makeup products or workout supplements or whatever, does this necessarily carry over to political opinions and actions?
Yes, it's funny. So I came from a political background, and when we kind of were starting this thing, we were all kind of, it was all hands on deck. I would say the people that came from more the influencer brand marketing world were able to translate into politics better than I was the other way around. And so it's similar. And I think a lot of it is it has to be relevant to the content that they're talking about. So you can't have an influencer be like, oh, I endorse Joe Biden. Just like, that's all they're going to say. It has to be relevant to like what they're talking about. So like, hey, I'm a parent and I do a lot of educational content for parents. And did you hear about the child tax credit? Or like, I'm a Tesla creator and I give you updates about Tesla. And did you hear about electronic vehicle charging stations? And it's about kind of matching their typical content to the messaging. and finding the creators who can who are already speaking about something kind of relevant, and it's almost more educating their audience about something their audience already wants to hear about.
This jibes very well with the academic research that shows that a lot of, really valuable political action comes out of things like parenting subreddits or gardening forums rather than spaces that are particularly political. So I'm curious, going back to this database, and as you're searching for influencers, are you searching for people who are not explicitly about politics, or do you also get into people who have already shown on their channel they're willing to engage in political issues as well?
It's a little bit of both. And for certain clients, we want certain things. So, if it's a client that has an issue where they're trying to get a lot of people to sign a petition or make a comment to Congress, we might want to use more politically active influencers because their audience is already a little more engaged. Whereas if we're doing something like get out the vote or voter registration, typically creators who aren't talking about politics would be better because their audience, might not be registered to vote, whereas someone who's constantly talking about politics, odds are most of their audience is registered. So, there's different reasons you would use different creators, and it just really depends on a client-to-client basis why we do certain things.
Right. Got it. So then kind of stepping back and looking at this kind of influencer marketing in general versus more mainstream social advertising. I think one of the benefits you get by advertising with a suite like Facebook or Instagram's ad targeting is that you get this really fine-grained data on the number of impressions, number of click-throughs, things like that. And from what I understand about influencer marketing, one of the main arguments for using it is that if a message goes viral, you could end up paying a lot less per view than you would, especially on, streaming services or television, but also mainstream platforms as well. So could you explain this dynamic for us? How can influencer marketing be cheaper than advertising on mainstream platforms? And then in your experience, are political messages even viable to get any significant amount of lift?
Yeah, it's all kind of at scale. So we'll typically, when we're doing a campaign, we typically will do at least kind of 9 creators. Like the smallest campaign we'll do will be at least 9 creators, because some are going to be done, some are going to go viral. But what we find is about a 3 cents cost per view, which is a lot cheaper than mail. I think it's a lot cheaper than targeted ads. I think it's similar to broadcast. So yeah, and I think if you just kind of do it at scale, like look at like the Willow Project from a couple months ago, like that was mostly influencers online pushing things.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about that project? I'm not familiar with it.
It was an environmental deal in something in Alaska that Biden wanted to kind of move forward, that a lot of just environmental creators kind of got together, said we don't want to do this. And it really kind of started organically online. And it eventually kind of seeped into mainstream media and wound up kind of like changing what they were going to do based on this kind of like online movement.
Interesting. So the online movement actually kind of started it, and then there was a push to kind of boost the message, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So, when I think about this argument that, it's the scale that matters, right? Like, I think one of the benefits of, as I said, advertising with an ad delivery service, whether it's streaming or mainstream social, whatever it is that you actually kind of know exactly more or less where the ad is going, because that's what you're paying for, right? So when you argue that, it's about the scale and it's about having organic content travel, then you're essentially banking on the algorithm to give you that exposure or give you that lift and ideally some virality. And then I wonder, there's people behind algorithms and there's companies behind algorithms. And so when it comes to TikTok in particular, I do wonder when it comes to political influencers, if the value proposition is that organic messages can get more reach for less pay, then in the case of TikTok, essentially the Chinese government can uprank and downrank political messages to American youth. And so the criticism there is that sort of a way of interfering in American elections through dialing up and down political content in the algorithms? I know it's a little bit of a stretch, but in theory, that could happen.
Yeah, so I would say it's, something to kind of watch. A good example, so we did a little study that was published in Forbes. I can send it to you afterwards. We were noticing that our Get Out the Vote content wasn't doing as well. So we had, I think it was 10 creators do a stated Get Out the Vote message and then do a message where instead of saying certain words like vote, election, they held a sign. So the speech to text algorithm wasn't picking it up. And the videos where they held a sign did 3 times better than the videos where they were saying go vote. So, was that because the algorithm knew that like people weren't interested in Delta messaging? Was it something more sinister? We'll never know. But it's something that like people should be aware of.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm sitting here saying, well, and this is kind of the regulator argument, right? Like, well, what if China is influencing what youth see in America about politics? But then I think if it's the case that the speech to text was sort of downranking political content, that's also an incentive for TikTok to be non-political, right? So that's more of a commercial incentive from the ownership in order to stay in business. And I hadn't thought about that. They have banned political advertising, right? TikTok.
Yeah, the official. So they don't want TikTok doesn't want people advertising on their platform because then they're kind of held liable. But we don't really see much like they don't. It's not like they take down our videos.
Yeah, interesting. Well, that brings up a point about TikTok potentially being banned, which there's been some discussions about for a couple of years. And I know you've talked previously on different podcasts that it's not so big a concern because these influencers operate on multiple platforms. And so if TikTok gets shut down, they'll surely find their audience somewhere else. But you've talked about Discord being an overlooked platform here. So can you describe what these Discord communities are like around influencers and how might they be used for political messaging?
Yeah, so the influencers have like they'll usually keep people in the Discord communities. It's easier, like they can set up bots. It's a lot easier for them to kind of market things. So what a lot of influencers have kind of told us, or creators kind of told us that they do, is they kind of use these algorithmic platforms like YouTube and TikTok to find supporters and then move them over to other platforms such as Discord and Twitch, where it's easier to monetize. So it's really whatever the creator wants to do. I have not seen necessarily creators like using their Discords for like heavy political stuff. And I think some of that's just, it's their channel. Like every now and then they might want to, post a political piece of content, but I haven't seen anyone necessarily use it to mobilize. What I have seen done well is a group called Progressive Victory that they've got a lot of Twitch creators to put people into one Discord that is then kind of used for action and volunteer work. So I've seen kind of that exist, and I think it'll kind of we'll see more and more of that. But right now, I think the creators are really using Discord as around themselves, and they'll do posts or things they care about. But I haven't seen a ton of like mobilization. What's great about Discord is it's a community. It is a community. I've seen campaigns use Discord really well. Like Andrew Yang used Discord really well in 2020. It was a great way to kind of get people involved, and we were able to move them over to Slack, which was a little easier to control. So I've seen it work in that sense, but I haven't really seen creators. Like I think creators, they're kind of like when they want to mobilize people, they're just going to make a post because it's going to have the largest reach, and they tend to use Discord for other things.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that. But then I was also thinking, because I think one of the important things to stress about Vocal is that, as you mentioned in the beginning, is that the money goes straight into the creator's hands, right? It's not getting kind of filtered through a super PAC or something like that. And the creators set their own price, as far as I understand as well. And I'm just curious, I mean, do you see any differences in what creators charge or how willing they are to send political messages on like TikTok versus a reel versus a YouTube short? I mean, are some platforms better than others? Are they more willing to go certain places with politics versus others? Or can you talk a little bit about those platform differences and the different types of media and platforms that are available to these creators?
I haven't seen a ton of pushback on like, oh, I'll do this platform and not that platform. A lot of them will actually wind up doing it on TikTok and a syndicated platform, so they usually wind up posting on the multiple ones. And there's reasons that we would prefer certain platforms. So like if you're trying to do click-throughs, Instagram's a little better, just the way it's set up. So there's reasons like we would prefer different platforms, but I haven't seen a lot of creators pushing back on like, oh, I don't want to use this platform or that platform. It's more like, I do or don't want to do this campaign in general.
Okay, I could just imagine a creator saying, no, like that's not going to go on my reels because my reels are this and not that. I don't know. I'm a little bit out of touch with the whole, Discord and TikTok and YouTube Shorts in particular. But I do want to ask you about, and you alluded to this before, is this kind of idea that it does seem to me that the way that I've seen political creators discussed is that it's really about just kind of passing a message through their platform and all this kind of trust and community that comes along with that. And it seems like, and I think you alluded to this as well, that it seems like they're better suited for mass broadcasting or kind of doing a one-off message to a large audience. But I do wonder, are there attempts to try to make it more sustained in a sense of more organizing in the kind of the more hardcore organizing sense? Or is it really just using their bullhorn to blast something out?
I think it's moving that way. So that's actually something we've been pushing. We did some of our larger clients at Planned Parenthood last cycle. We did long-term cohorts where we have a dozen creators produce 3 posts per month. They have their audience get a really strong feel for like what Planned Parenthood does, what services does it offer, how can it help you, how can it like affect your everyday life. I think what you're describing, we're going to see a lot more of that in 2024 as well.
Yeah. And then my last question has to do exactly with that, because I mean, I think this would be the natural way that political tech evolves, right? It starts out in this kind of beta period, and then it usually ends up moving towards organization, right? This was the MyBo page in 2008, for example. And so I'm just curious to get your thoughts on what do you think this 2024 cycle will bring in terms of innovation? Are we going to see influencers really fully mature in this cycle, or is it still going to be this kind of experimental touch and go type of relationship with campaigns, do you think?
I think it's going to mature. I mean, I personally haven't had any conversations with them, but like you can kind of see in the press, like the White House is doing a lot of stuff with influencers. My guess is it'll be a big part of the campaign, but I have no idea. The other thing I think you'll see is it's just becoming more accessible. So you're going to, I think instead of like 1 or 2 big influencers, you're going to see a lot of smaller people. The other thing is what's changing with the algorithm is it's less based on followers and more based on content. So for example, like you could have a ton of followers in Florida, but if you're doing something talking about Texas, it's going to show more people in Texas than it would have shown them before. So I think you're just going to get, it's not so much like, oh, this influencer is going to reach these people. It's much more about like what the content is, how that's going. And I think you're just going to see a lot more kind of smaller influencers. The other thing I'm seeing a lot more of is kind of like the stand pages where like it's just like clips of people speaking as opposed to like someone talking, this person. It's just like who's necessarily behind this. And then I think the other thing you'll see, we saw a little bit of this in 20, is also just influencers that we've never heard of before, realizing, oh, like I can make money becoming an influencer, becoming big Biden influencers that aren't necessarily even getting paid, and just working in the ecosystem. Trump had a lot of that on Yang. There were these 2 people, they called them the Zach and Matt show. And, they were trying to be political YouTubers, and the 8th video or something, they covered Andrew Yang, it did well. And that's all their content wound up being, but they were never hired by the campaign. They didn't start as Yang influencers. There was basically a market of people who wanted a Yang influencer. They kind of stepped into it. And I think you're just going to see a lot more of that. I think to kind of bring things full circle, it's just going to become a lot more distributed, a lot more kind of equalized, and everyone's going to be on the same playing field a lot more than they had been in the past. And I think that trend is just going to continue and continue and continue, where anyone can kind of make a difference. Like one example I love to give is if you remember in 2020, the Trump Tulsa rally, where they got everyone to do the fake tickets and then no one showed up. I don't know if you remember that, but that was actually done by a 53-year-old grandmother in Iowa who had like less than 1,000 followers, and she just. And, that was 3 years ago. I think you're just going to see this lot more of that with the everyday average person. It's just going to make a huge impact. And lastly, also with like as Gen Z continues to vote, and as Gen Z, more of them come of age, they continue to vote more and more. They really follow the influencers. They don't trust traditional media, so it's going to become important in that way. Just as Gen Z and millennials become a larger voting bloc.
Yeah, there's a lot of wheels moving here, and it's actually something that I'm perhaps even more excited than who's going to be in the general election is what's going to be the impact of influencers on this election. So it's cool to hear from someone working in this space about what the kind of plans are going forward and what's happening now. So Zach, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Thank you. It was fun.
I've just been speaking with Zach Fang, Head of Sales and Business Development at Vocal Media. Check the episode description to learn more about Vocal and a link to the Forbes study that Zach mentioned. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I've got a couple more recording plans before heading off to summer vacation, so keep an eye on those feeds. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Melba. See you next time.